when your dream collapses, finding peace after professional loss. A heavy, tight, and thoroughly crushing contraction is fixing itself into the very center of your solar plexus right now, leaving your ribs feeling stiff and your breath trapped high in your throat. You are lying perfectly still in the dark, yet your intellect is restlessly pacing the fractured ruins of an unfulfilled ambition, a derailed career path, or a deeply cherished life dream that has collapsed entirely out of your control. There is a cold, bitter sense of internal failure circulating through your frame, a quiet, agonizing friction that reactivates every time you remember the professional milestones that were suddenly swept away, the creative potentials that withered before their time, or the painful realization that the future you meticulously engineered has been shattered by an unpredictable storm. The exhausting habit of mentally replaying the exact moment the trajectory broke has left you feeling like a severed branch, completely cut off from your planned source of growth, discarded by the changing seasons, and deeply isolated in your current reality. Let the specific, cool, and highly grounding atmosphere of this quiet room begin to absorb the smoldering disappointment within your heart. The air surrounding your bed does not carry the typical warmth of an active house. Instead, it is infused with the crisp, clean scents of frozen earth, damp sphagnum moss, and the subtle, bittersweet aroma of bruised plum bark exposed to the northern air. Beneath your body, the mattress provides a wide, unhurried wintering ground, a dense and unyielding baseline that has absolutely no need for a visible achievement or a successful milestone to maintain its complete, unshakable stability. This surface offers a protective sanctuary that is perfectly designed to take your entire physical mass, completely removing the requirement to look successful, professionally secure, or recovered from the loss for the eyes of the world. Right now, dear friend, you are safe enough to soften into this deep shadow. You are not broken because your grand design has fractured, and the heavy emptiness you are navigating tonight is not a personal failure. It is simply the natural, dense protection of a structure that has been forced to stay rigid to preserve its dignity. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and you do not have to solve your whole life tonight. Consider a profound, comforting paradox that lies at the very center of this professional dislocation. The agonizing tightness you are feeling right now is not actually caused by the loss of your original path. We are conditioned to believe that our current inner peace depends entirely on resurrecting our collapsed plans, forcing a derailed ambition back into alignment, or proving to the world that our initial potential was valid. But deep Buddhist insight reveals that the heavy grief we carry at night is not the distant echo of the failure itself, but the active, continuous contraction of our own internal pathways trying to pump vital energy into a future that has already finished its season. The suffering is the muscle memory of the old design, the internal strain that continues to force a severed scion to grow on a branch that no longer exists. The moment you stop trying to keep that dead trajectory alive through sheer personal willpower and allow your uncarved mass to drop flat into the damp moss of reality, you discover that your life possesses an independent, deep-rooted stream that can rest securely in the dark without needing a specific fruit to remain completely whole. Perhaps you have felt this too during the long, solitary hours of the evening, the relentless, looping necessity to review your missed opportunities, combined with a heavy guilt that tells you that if you cannot immediately pivot, rebuild, or achieve an absolute state of unbothered prosperity, you are permanently damaged and obsolete. We treat our unfulfilled dreams like an absolute verdict on our core worth, spending our night hours measuring our lack of progress against the thriving groves of others, and trying to fix ourselves through a secondary layer of self-reproach. This defensive posture only adds an exhausting psychological weight to the genuine raw hurt of a disappointed heart. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the crisp, damp air fill the very base of your diaphragm, moving beneath the tight knot in your sternum, entering the quiet, unmoving mass of your lower body. You do not need to force any immediate transformation right now, and absolutely nothing is required of you to be held safely by the earth. Imagine leaving behind the loud, competitive marketplaces of the lower valley and stepping onto the terraced stone orchard slopes exposed to the crisp northern air. where the old walls screen out the noise of expectations completely. In this quiet subalpine sanctuary, slender fruit tree branches, severed from an original fallen grove, are bound carefully to the rugged, deeply rooted trunk of a wild mountain plum tree, using damp sphagnum moss and coarse hemp cords. They are not being aggressively forced to blossom out of season. They are simply left undisturbed through the freezing winter, allowing the separate sap streams to naturally find a single, quiet rhythm in the dark. There are no expectations here, no professional metrics for you to maintain tonight, and no broken identities for you to manually stitch back together. There is only the cool, mineral patience of the terraced stone, and the immense peace of a realm that knows how to hold a resting form, without demanding that it bear fruit before its time. You have arrived at a baseline where you can finally drop the burden of your life architecture, stepping into a sensory world that allows you to trade the frantic panic of a ruined dream for the heavy, horizontal safety of an independent night. High on the terraced stone slopes where the mountain wind tasted of frozen earth and old rock, the winter silence was absolute. In this remote orchard lived a young cultivator named Juro for nearly a decade. Juro had poured his entire life's energy into a low-lying valley grove, meticulously grooming a rare strain of sweet pear trees that he believed would define his life's success and guarantee his family's position in the region. But an unexpected summer landslide had swept down the valley wall, completely burying his orchard under 15 feet of sharp limestone gravel and leaving his grand professional design entirely in ruins. Juro had fled the suffocating view of that wreckage, climbing into the upper terraces while carrying a single slender scion, a small living twig he had broken from his favorite fallen tree moments before the earth covered it completely. His body had become a knot of rigid resistance, his teeth constantly grinding in the dark as his intellect restlessly replayed the exact trajectory of the landslide, wondering how he could have reinforced the stone retaining walls or avoided the catastrophic failure of his ambitions. Seeking a way to heal the bitter contraction that kept his limbs locked throughout the long night hours, Yipro approached Master Koi, an elderly, half-blind mountain orchardist who lived in a small stone hut built directly against the steep mountain terrace. Koi was a silent master of the wintering cycles, a man who spent his days moving with a dense, heavy slow motion across the rocky tiers, completely unbothered by the lack of immediate blossoms or early summer fruits. The entire slope smelled richly of damp sphagnum moss, bruised plum bark, and the sharp, clean chill of the northern air. Koi did not maintain a pristine, symmetrical greenhouse. He worked with the rugged, twisted realities of the mountain, grafting delicate, displaced varieties onto the unpolished, ancient trunks of wild plum trees that had survived the frost for half a century. One evening, as a thick crust of winter frost began to crystallize along the stone terraces, Juro sat near the charcoal brazier inside the hut, his chest tight with the weight of his unfulfilled potential. He pulled the dry, wrapped scion from his sleeve and confessed to Koi the deep sense of failure that kept his breathing trapped high in his throat, replaying the loops of his lost years, his shatters in the valley marketplace, and the agonizing midnight habit of feeling like a useless, severed branch that had no right to exist without its original roots. He asked the old man how to force this single, dying twig to grow into a complete tree on its own, or how to build a mental wall that would prevent the memory of his ruined valley grove from hollowing out his vital essence. Koi did not answer with words. Instead, he reached into a wooden bucket by his feet and pulled out a long bundle of frayed hemp binding twine that had been soaking in cold mountain well water for days. The twine was a heavy, dripping cord of coarse fibers that had become thoroughly saturated, its rough surface cold and completely pliable from its long immersion in the mineral-rich water. It held no shape of its own, entirely content to rest in the master's palm without resisting the curve of his fingers. Koi handed this wet bundle to Juro and instructed him to wrap it around the dry, splintered trunk of a dead plum post that sat near the doorway, telling him to bind it so tightly that not a single drop of water could escape the fiber. Juro took the coarse cord and began to pull against the dead wood with all his remaining strength, his knuckles locking and his shoulder blades hardening as he tried to force the wet hemp into a seamless, bone-dry seal. But the harder he strained against the unyielding wood, the more the rough fibers bit into his skin, and the stored water simply squirted through his fingers, splashing uselessly onto the cold stone floor while the twine frayed under the maximum velocity of his effort. "Observe the flow," Koei said, his voice low and unhurried, like the steady dripping of water beneath an ice crust. The elder orchardist gently took the remaining length of wet twine from Juro's raw hands and led him out into the freezing darkness of the terrace slope, where an ancient, wild mountain plum tree stood anchored deep within the rocky crevice. Without any aggression, Koei placed Juro's slender, severed scion against a fresh, clean cut on the rugged trunk of the wild plum, matching the exposed inner bark of the twig to the deep living sapwood of the mountain tree. The old master did not use a mallet or iron pins to force the woods together. He simply took the wet, pliable hemp twine and wrapped it with a gentle, rhythmic discipline around the joint, layering it with a thick cushion of damp sphagnum moss to steal out the freezing northern air. Juro watched in absolute silence as the coarse cord, which had frayed and failed when forced against dead wood, now conformed perfectly to the organic shape of the living graft, holding the two separate structures in a tight, protective embrace beneath the winter sky. Koei looked at Juro through the dim starlight and asked a single quiet question that pierced straight through his defensive architecture. Is the severed branch dying because it was cut from its original grove, or because you are using all your strength to hold it in the air, refusing to let it touch a new root? Juro looked down at the newly bound graft, comparing the quiet, receptive position of the branch to the rigid, protective posture he had maintained in his own chest for months. He realized that the agonizing tightness in his solar plexus was not a sign of his enduring dedication to his dream, but the calcified residue of his own resistance to the reality of the landslide. The branch was not inherently worthless because its original setting had vanished. It was simply waiting to absorb the deeper, slower sap of a tree it had never planned to meet. The pain he carried every night was not the loss of his status in the valley, but the continuous, exhausting strain of his own mind trying to hold up an isolated future through the sheer willpower of regret. But the wild plum tree at his feet was entirely stable, whole, and unbothered precisely because it had dropped the effort to dictate which branch should feed upon its ancient root. A profound wave of emotional recognition loosened the cold knot behind Juro's ribs, allowing his breath to sink into his lower abdomen for the first time since the valley grove had been buried. He saw that his entire internal struggle had been an impossible attempt to force a ruined dream back into alignment through the velocity of overthinking, believing that if he stopped replaying his failure, his vital energy would vanish entirely. He had treated his bitterness as a necessary shield, completely blind to the reality that his own life was already wide enough and grounded enough to absorb the collapse of his ambition without losing its native integrity. He did not need to rebuild the valley grove to become soft. His baseline was restored the moment he allowed his history to be bound to the unhurried reality of the current winter. The mountain night was sealing the stone terraces in an absolute uniform dark now, the crisp winter breeze moving quietly over the dormant grafts without shaking their protective straw wrapping the clean, earthy scent of the damp sphagnum moss and the frozen loam hung suspended in the heavy air, drawing Juro's attention entirely away from the old archives of his grief. Take a slow, horizontal breath, letting your own ribs soften into the deep baseline of your bed, allowing your nervous system to rest upon the cool, silent earth as it settles into the quiet dark of the night. This old story from the stone terraces is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold, frozen stone or entirely numb to the very real ache of navigating a shattered life ambition, a collapsed career path, or a deeply cherished dream that has fallen completely out of your hands. It is not an instruction to lock your heart away in a dark winter cellar, pretending that the loss of a decade's worth of effort or the sudden collapse of your social status does not leave a genuine, throbbing bruise across your personal history. It is showing us something much quieter, a profound shift in our internal posture that allows us to inhabit our independent life without letting it become an object of constant, exhausting emotional reconstruction. When we sit in the dark and look at our late-night professional grievances, we begin to see that the deep, suffocating exhaustion we carry does not actually stem from the landslide that buried our old path. The true suffering, the knot that contracts your solar plexus and turns your sleep into a trial, resides not only in what happened when your plans were ruined, but in the specific way the mind continues to hold the defense long after the trajectory has finished its season. In our modern inner lives, what we call attachment is that frantic, hypervigilant urge to force our current presence into a rigid scaffolding that will guarantee our safety from the threat of future failure. It is the desperate craving to extract a victory from a memory, a silent belief that if we can just brace our life layout against an imaginary redo, we will finally be safe from the cold winds of obsolescence. This craving operates exactly like a stiff hemp cord pulling against its own fibers, continually straining our vital energy through endless loops of psychological review, believing that if we remain hyper-conscious of our lost potential, we can prevent future disappointment. We become like a cultivator who spends his vital nighttime hours frantically trying to wrap a wet cord around a dead post with his bare hands, completely blind to the reality that trying to maintain an unnatural resistance is what truly breaks our structural capacity to rest. The ancient insights of Buddhist wisdom help us stop adding a second wound to the first. The first wound is the baseline vulnerability that life brings to our practical architecture, the sudden market shift, the unexpected displacement, the heavy realization that a corporate or creative dream could not survive the changing environment, or the simple truth that human endeavors are subject to the same erosion and flaws as any organic system. These moments are painful, and they leave a real stinging heat across our awareness. The second wound, however, is the massive edifice of personal shame, chronic resentment, and late-night trial scenes that we build around that initial vacancy. It is the secondary spiral where the mind convinces us that if we stop holding up the shield or analyzing the failure for even a single hour, we are accepting total defeat and letting our unworthiness win. This continuous saturation of our own self-worth in the brine of old regret is what truly depletes our body, trapping our nervous system in a permanent alarm that refuses to let the muscles soften. When we practice true mindfulness within our somatic self, we are simply learning how to view our history through a cool, non-judgmental awareness. This awareness is the quiet, grounding quality of the mind that can notice the burning heat of a professional setback without choosing to step directly into the habit of self-loathing or frantic pivoting. It is the capacity to feel the tight contraction in your ribs or the heavy lock in your throat and say, "There is a dense point of vulnerability here in my frame," rather than, "I must aggressively change the past before I am worthy of entering the quiet." By shifting our relationship with this old hurt, letting go ceases to mean passive approval of failure or forgetting what we worked for instead. Letting go becomes an act of immense, quiet sovereignty, the willingness to step back from the ruined valley, allowing your hardened identity to drop flat into the damp, fertile sphagnum moss until the frantic urge to argue stops vibrating through your limbs. Impermanence, when felt deeply within the organic reality of the body, becomes a source of profound relief rather than a cause for dread. Every human contract, every conventional tie of status, and every high-profile role we were forced to play during our peak productivity eventually loses its momentum, shifts its foundation, and yields to the changing earth. The milestones that seemed so permanent and terrifying during our shared youth are subject to the same decay as a piece of fruitwood left out in the subalpine weather. An old displacement or a lack of linear progress cannot permanently destroy your internal integrity unless you continuously pick up the iron pins to nail your spirit to a disappearing wall. Wisdom reminds us that the most heavily armored and defensive structures quickly reveal their brittle nature when life shifts, while the heart that knows how to rest horizontally at the bottom of its own vast space remains entirely secure. Compassion, in this dark, earthy light, is the spacious clay that meets your practical panic without turning your unfulfilled potential into a source of personal failure. It is the willingness to look at the defensive, hardened part of your mind and recognize that this heavy loop of career review is not a defect in your spiritual character. It is simply a tired, primitive part of your survival biology that has been staying awake to protect your borders, believing that if it stops criticizing your history, you will be left entirely exposed to the coldness of the world. By meeting this internal builder with a slow, heavy, and completely unbothered physical presence, you allow the frantic necessity to defend yourself to dissolve, transforming the brittle desire for an immediate victory into a dense, grounding mineral weight. In a moment, this horizontal clarity will move from an idea you listen to into a concrete physical practice you can truly drop your entire weight into. The crisp, damp air within our quiet terrace orchard remains perfectly still, totally unconcerned with the grand professional displays of the lower valley marketplaces. The wild plum stems hold their immense mass in absolute, dignified silence, allowing the frozen moss to soothe their joints without any need to justify their yield to a passerby. Take another slow, intentional breath, letting the hot static in your temples sink flat into the mattress as we prepare to guide the mind into a much deeper state of physical relaxation. If it feels right, allow the physical boundaries of your body to sink fully into the level surface that supports you tonight, surrendering your entire somatic weight into the quiet foundation below. There is no need to engineer an artificial stillness within your mind, nor is there any requirement to alter the simple automatic cadence of your breathing as it moves quietly across your lips. Perhaps you can simply observe the cool, damp air entering your lungs, unhurried and deep, leaving a subtle trace of winter earth and frozen moss as it exits your frame. With each slow, horizontal exhalation, you might allow the sharp edges of your jaw, your shoulders, and the small, hypervigilant muscles around your ribs to lose their tight configurations. Imagine your physical self sinking down into the dense, dark baseline of the mattress, dropping the defensive posture of the day completely, like a rugged plum trunk that has finally been laid flat inside a deep, cool mountain terrace. As you lie here in the deep shadow of your room, you might shift your internal focus away from the vertical, straining territory of the temples and the forehead, allowing your center of gravity to settle deep into the base of your hips. For many hours, your vital energy has been pulled upward into a hot, vibrating knot of professional grievance, tensing like fibers under a heavy strain as you tried to manually defend your history against the ghosts of a broken life dream. Right now, there is no need to force that momentum to vanish instantly, even noticing the faint, rhythmic expansion of your lower abdomen as it rises and falls is entirely enough to anchor you to the ground. You do not have to perform this meditation perfectly to prove your emotional resilience to an invisible judge. There is no score being kept on this terraced mountain slope, no penalty for carrying an unpolished past, and absolutely nothing you are required to fix before you are permitted to drop your effort into the dark. In this open, non-judgmental space of your own awareness, you might allow one specific recurring thought or memory from your unfulfilled potential to appear without trying to fight its presence. Perhaps it is a sudden market shift that left you feeling completely obsolete, an unexpected displacement that hardened your heart, or a persistent urge to stay awake to mentally settle an old account with a lost milestone. Do not try to aggressively push this memory out of your head, and do not dive into its details to argue with the circumstances in your imagination tonight. Instead, if it feels right, you can name the emotional pattern softly to yourself, perhaps using the silent words holding the scaffolding, twisting the wet cord, or bracing against the storm. Recognizing the habit in this gentle way is enough to create a small, cool distance between your core self and the heat of the disappointment. Once you have named the pattern, you might imagine taking that entire burning narrative and placing it gently into the damp, pliable fibers of the wet hemp binding twine that rests in the dark trench of the mountain slope. Let the heavy, saturated cord hold the entire weight of that career grievance for you. In your imagination, you can reach down and touch that rough, cool surface chilled by the subalpine air, smelling of fresh well water and completely detached from the competitive demands of the valley marketplace. Gently, without any sense of anger or violence, you might allow your awareness to merge with that resting object, letting your self-image rest directly upon its unmoving, flat position at the base of the wild plum stem. There is no need to force a sudden catharsis or to demand that your mind instantly forgive the disappointment. You are simply allowing the frantic necessity to defend your history to drop flat against the bedrock. Watch what happens to that image when you stop feeding the memory with the fresh energy of your overthinking. You might notice that as you leave the worry resting within the heavy, dark depths of the wet sphagnum moss, the erratic, straining tension of your analytical habits naturally begins to lose its velocity. The cool, dense earth does not fight the bitterness, it outlasts it, holding your presence perfectly still within a dark, self-contained realm of mountain clay until the volatile anxiety naturally runs out of momentum. The urgent necessity to rebuild the valley grove begins to dissolve, replaced by the deep, horizontal density of a frame that is far too grounded to be broken by a failure. The mind stops pulling against the old exclusion and begins the quiet, slow process of settling into an unshakable baseline of inner peace. If your mind occasionally drifts back into its old habit of drafting defenses, or if a sudden wave of professional grief surfaces around your collarbones, remember that you can return to the cool, grounding texture of your breath whenever you are ready. There is no timeline you must follow tonight, and no one is asking you to promise your nervous system a state of permanent, immediate healing. True transformation does not happen by violently erasing your natural vulnerability, but by realizing that your awareness is like the vast, subterranean mountain terrace itself, capacious enough to let the raw materials rest safely in the dark without needing to straighten them by force. Let each slow, unhurried breath feel like the natural grounding of a weight, allowing your limbs to become heavy, porous, and completely unresponsive to the urgent static of the daytime world. In a moment, our journey will return to the stone orchard shelter, following Juro as the seasons shift and bring an unexpected challenge that will test the true stability of his uncoiled heart. The deep, dark textures of the old orchardist's clearing will continue to open a path toward an absolute, indestructible form of inner sovereignty. For now, simply allow yourself to remain right here, unmoving and encased in this protective shadow, letting each breath sink you an inch deeper into the vast, horizontal safety of the night. 3 winters had rolled across the high ridges, encrusting the stone walls under massive shelves of frozen white frost, before the heavy northern gales finally locked the terrace orchard in an absolute unmoving silence. Juro spent his long, solitary nights working alongside the wild mountain plum trees, his fingers slowly growing accustomed to the blunt, cold texture of the protective straw wrapping, his breathing gradually finding the steady, horizontal rhythm of the rocky tier below. One freezing afternoon, as a bitter sleet began to coat the stone hut roof, the heavy oak doors of the tool storage shed creaked open, and 2 exhausted travelers stumbled into the damp warmth of the space. They were regional land inspectors from the lower valleys who had been caught by the sudden blizzard while evaluating the high mountain boundary lines. Among them, wrapped in a tattered, frozen wool cloak, was the very valley merchant who had purchased the mortgage on Juro's original hillside grove just days after the landslide, who had foreclosed on his remaining land without an ounce of flexibility, and whose face had remained the primary symbol of Juro's Latinite bitterness for 3 long years. The merchant did not recognize Juro in the dim, smoky light of the stone hut, his eyes glazed with exhaustion, his limbs shaking violently from the early stages of frostbite. But the moment Juro looked upon the merchant's face, his entire physical framework tightened with an intense, reactive heat. The old professional wound flared up with a searing force, tempting him to step forward and reveal himself in anger, to refuse them shelter by the hot charcoal brazier, or to use this sudden reversal of fortune to humiliate the person who had stolen his sense of career accomplishment. The mind immediately began to spin a complex, vindictive web of justifications, telling him that this man's suffering was a form of cosmic justice for the callous way his own life dream had been dismantled. Juro's fingers gripped a small, curved, crescent-shaped brass pruning knife, a blunt, massive tool used to trim the wild suckers from the base of the plum stems. The pruning knife was saturated with decades of cold mineral oil, its surface smooth and dark from constant immersion in the winter orchard work. Touching that heavy, unyielding piece of brass brought an immediate somatic recollection of the grafted scions resting flat against the rugged plum trunks, entirely free from the necessity of fighting the elements, because they had already surrendered their life flow to the deeper baseline. Juro stood perfectly still in the center of the wet stone floor, his knuckles white against the dark wooden handle. Instead of allowing his reactive thoughts to dictate his movements, he chose one small, quiet act of discipline. He paused before speaking, took a single, slow breath, and let the crisp, scented air expand into the very base of his spine, allowing the hot thoughts of vengeance to sit on his surface like steam on cold rock, without treating a single one of them as an absolute command. In that deliberate interval of physical stillness, a profound realization opened up within his framework, changing his relationship to his own history of professional pain. He looked at his shivering enemy, who was now weeping softly from the pain of the cold, and realized that he no longer needed to carry the anger to prove that the original foreclosure had been unfair. He saw that this merchant, the valley inspectors, and the entire commercial marketplace were merely fragile pieces of material being tossed about by the changing storms of the lower valley, constantly trying to brace themselves against an unpredictable world through greed, calculation, and defensive alliances. He stopped resisting the reality of his unfulfilled ambition, allowing the empty space of his lost valley grove to exist without transforming it into a permanent declaration of his own structural unworthiness. He did not pretend that the financial betrayal had not left a deep, jagged scar across his memory, but he stopped using that scar as a weapon to chip away at his own current integrity. A wave of unpolished, sovereign compassion moved through Juro's chest, entirely independent of any desire for an apology or a public reconciliation. Without revealing his identity or demanding an explanation, he stepped forward, laid down the crescent pruning knife, and gently reached for the merchant's frozen leather boots. The material was stiff, salt-crusted, and frozen solid by the alpine ice, cracking under the slightest pressure exactly like the dry hemp cords from years before. Juro did not pull aggressively against the stiff material. Instead, he brought a shallow wooden basin filled with the warm, dark water from the hearth and gently submerged the man's feet, allowing the heat and the natural oils to slowly dissolve the ice. He did not wait for a word of gratitude, nor did he look up to see if Master Koi was observing his virtue. He simply went about the honest, quiet labor of treating the frozen tissue, experiencing for the first time the deep internal equilibrium of a frame that rests entirely on its own foundation. The subalpine night was sealing the stone terrace in an absolute, uniform dark now, the howling wind outside the rock walls turning into a distant background murmur. The clean, grounding aroma of the wet sphagnum moss and the frozen loam hung suspended in the heavy air, drawing Juro's attention all the way down into the solid mass of his lower body. He had not achieved a state of magical, effortless perfection, and the memories still carried a cold weight during the long winter hours, but he had discovered how to let his history rest flat at the base of the plum trunk, without needing to hold up a shield for the world to admire. Take a slow, horizontal breath, letting your own ribs soften into this level mattress, allowing your awareness to rest upon the blunt, smooth face of the brass knife as it settles into the quiet depth of the night. This internal stiffness we carry into our midnight hours is the direct result of a complex, unconscious bracing process that the mind mistakenly initiates to protect itself from the cold winds of practical vulnerability. When a career grievance or a shattered life dream settles into your framework, the immediate response of your nervous system is not to relax into the empty space of that missing validation, but to build an elaborate, invisible armor of defensive calculations. You lie awake under the cover of the dark, your muscles locked into a rigid posture, while your intellect relentlessly rehearses future encounters and replays past disappointments, trying to figure out exactly how the professional layout failed and who was responsible for the structural collapse. This continuous mental labor is a desperate, frantic bid for control and illusion that if you can just analyze the market dynamics long enough, or hold your body tightly enough against the old hurt, you can somehow prevent your identity from dissolving into total ruin. We become deeply habituated to this state of internal resistance, eventually turning the localized pain of an unfulfilled ambition into a permanent, defining identity. When a practical betrayal occurs, The mind doesn't simply record the event as a changing shift in your career history. It takes the bitter pieces and builds a monument of self-judgment in the center of your chest. You begin to define yourself as the broken branch, the unpolished material that was inherently unfit to bear fruit, or the person who is destined to remain perpetually saturated in the sour brine of resentment. To maintain this heavy identity, you are forced to treat every passing thought about your unworthiness as an absolute, undeniable truth, continually picking up the iron mallet of shame to chisel away at your own current baseline. We try to fix ourselves through self-reproach, believing that if we remain hyper-conscious of our perceived flaws, we are somehow earning our way back towards safety and approval. But the ancient, quiet clarity of Buddhist wisdom reveals that the true source of your midnight exhaustion is never the practical history itself, but the specific way your mind has chosen to manage the wreckage. Every emotional disaster is composed of two entirely distinct layers. The first pain, which is the raw material that life drops into your clearing, and the second pain, which is the immense, suffocating framework that your thoughts add to the initial fracture. The first pain is the unvarnished reality of the breakage, the cold look, the unfair foreclosure, the empty space where achievement should have been, or the blunt truth that human systems occasionally yield to their own inherited limitations and flaws. This initial sting is an occurrence that moves through your timeline like a sudden freeze over a mountain terrace. It leaves a real, stinging heat across your awareness, but it does not possess the capacity to permanently destroy your core pliability unless you choose to continuously re-immerse the tissue in the salt. The second pain is the elaborate maze of psychological resistance, historical regret, and invisible trial scenes that you build around that empty space. The second pain is the voice that takes an old failure and transforms it into an absolute sentence of permanent isolation, telling you that because your dream could not blossom properly, your foundation is utterly ruined. We cannot always control the first pain, as life will occasionally shift the configurations of our career without asking for our consent. But we have the absolute capacity to stop feeding the secondary armor with our vital energy. Every time you notice your intellect spinning a brilliant Latinite defense or rereading an old interaction to find a hidden meaning, and you choose instead to drop your attention straight down into the level weight of your lower ribs, you are starving the second pain of the oxygen it requires to keep your nervous system in a state of permanent alarm. True inner peace, when understood through this rugged agricultural perspective, is never defined as the total absence of difficulty, loneliness, or relational change. It is not a state of magical numbness where you no longer care about the things you spent your youth building, nor is it a pristine hall that is completely insulated from the market storms. Peace is simply a fundamentally different relationship with that difficulty when it arrives. It is the capacity to feel the tight contraction in your stomach and the heavy lock in your jaw, and realize that your solitary framework is wide enough, deep enough, and patient enough to contain that raw energy without needing to build an imaginary bridge over the abyss to change the past. You stop treating your feelings of hardness as a command to fix the outcome immediately, and you begin to discover that your individual skeleton possesses its own central gravity, perfectly capable of balancing its own mass upon the unmoving architecture of the earth. By understanding this internal mechanism, you can finally grant yourself permission to step down from the watchtower and stop trying to solve the entire layout of your practical history in a single night. You do not have to force your grief to vanish instantly, nor do you need to look for an immediate, dramatic transformation to prove your spiritual worth to the valley below. You can simply allow the empty space of your unfulfilled potential to exist as a quiet, unmeasured margin in the room, trusting that the natural, horizontal mass of your body is far too grounded to be shattered by an unwritten future. The heavy fibers of your structure are no longer straining toward an absent validation. They are dropping straight down, sinking into the deep protective shelter of a baseline that requires absolutely no external prop to remain entirely whole. Let this horizontal clarity pass from an idea you analyze into a concrete, physical weight that anchors your entire frame to the mattress right now. The clean, crisp aroma of the damp sphagnum moss and the frozen loam within your room remains perfectly balanced, completely unaffected by the chaotic construction projects of the daytime world. Your bones are growing increasingly porous, heavy, and non-reactive, absorbing the deep shadow of the evening without a single condition or judgment. Allow your breathing to become quiet, slow, and horizontal, a soft tide moving through an interior landscape that has completely abandoned the exhausting habit of the shield, resting profoundly within the immense, self-contained safety of your own quiet night. This dark, absorptive grafting equilibrium is not an isolated concept designed to be locked away behind an old stone wall or left entirely on the frosty terraces of a remote mountain orchard. True inner peace is practiced in the very small, unpolished friction points that make up the raw, demanding texture of your modern daily life. It is found in that exact second when you are lying awake at night, checking your phone for a glimmer of reassurance about a business venture, a project, or a creative path. Watching the small glass screen cast a cold, flickering glow across your bedroom ceiling because an acknowledgement, a promotion, or a recovery has never arrived. In that moment, the old habit of your nervous system is to treat the digital silence or the slow progress as an absolute professional collapse, a signal that your individual worth has been permanently compromised and that you must immediately draft a mental argument to fix the gap. True wisdom begins when you notice that frantic impulse, pause before touching the device, and realize that the delay does not decrease your own internal structural density by a single grain. We live in an accelerated culture that constantly demands we act like perfectly aligned, unblemished structures, presenting a smiling, symmetrical facade to our professional and social circles even when our interior framework feels heavy, lopsided, and filled with a thick smoke of unspoken grief over what we had hoped to build. You might find yourself sitting through a long meeting or a family gathering, smiling and cooperating automatically, while feeling completely heavy inside, or replaying a decades-old mistake you made during a sleepless night because an old professional failure still stings your ego. We look at the achievements of our peers or competitors. We compare our private, uncarved struggles to their bright, geometric trajectories, and we instantly decide that we are falling hopelessly behind the conventional timeline of a successful life. The mind creates a false sense of absolute emergency, telling you that if you do not instantly fix your status, your productivity, or your fractured career dynamics by tomorrow morning, you will be permanently excluded from safety. But a profound transformation occurs when you discover that not every frantic thought deserves your active obedience, and not every anxious feeling is an absolute command that requires a reaction. When you feel a sudden surge of practical panic, prompting you to launch into a reckless pivot or force an immediate outcome to gain control over a collapsing situation, you can choose to simply sit with the raw texture of the uncertainty rather than running to manipulate the situation. Taking a slow, heavy breath before answering an urgent message or reacting to an unfair setback from a market shift is a form of immense internal discipline. It is a way of demonstrating to your own body that you are no longer a fragile cord that will snap at the slightest pull of the wind. You can care deeply about your creative work and your practical aspirations without gripping their immediate execution so tightly that you fracture your own core. You can support your responsibilities from a place of dense, self-contained mass, like a cool earth mound resting securely in the shadows, rather than as an overstrained wire waiting to be broken by a change in the weather. This also means that you are entirely permitted to drop into an absolute, deep rest tonight without needing to earn it through a day of flawless productivity or external validation. Many of us carry a heavy, silent guilt the moment our bodies try to soften, believing that if we are not actively weaving, planning, or resolving a conflict for our futures, we are failing. But your fundamental value as a living presence is not a commercial product that fluctuates based on how many practical outcomes you managed to secure before the sun went down. You do not have to settle your entire career layout before you are allowed to close your eyes, nor do you need to apologize for seeking a sanctuary from the relentless noise of the lower valleys. Rest is not a luxury reserved for those who have achieved a perfect pattern of material success. It is the natural native right of a physical frame that belongs to the heavy, uncarved bedrock of the world. Let this independent perspective occupy your physical awareness right now, as you lie beneath the heavy covers of your bed. When the memory of an old unfulfilled ambition or a bitter practical setback tries to pull your attention back up into the hot, friction-filled air of overthinking, let the sheer weight of your bones serve as your anchor, pulling you straight down into the immediate dark. You can acknowledge that the difficult displacement occurred without allowing it to dictate the shape of your current night. By choosing to let the memory sit on your surface beneath a thick, moist blanket of non-judgmental presence, you are gradually retraining your mind to understand that it is safe to step down from the scaffolding. In a moment, the final echoes of these modern applications will begin to cool down entirely, letting the teaching pass from language into pure, inert sleep. The space surrounding your bed is growing increasingly heavy, the dark air absorbing your presence without a single condition, measurement, or judgment. You do not need to hold a rigid design for anyone tonight. You are simply a loose, unknotted material resting undisturbed in the deep shadows of the room, completely hidden, completely non-reactive, and absolutely safe in your own quiet night. The active, balancing friction of your thoughts is beginning to lose its draft now, cooling down into the quiet corners of the room like a heavy layer of frost settling over a deep stone terrace. When the long winter storm has spent its energy, the absolute necessity to build a defense, the habit of tracking these historical career grievances, and the drive to fix your unfulfilled ambition can all be left behind on the rocky ground tonight. Your physical frame is becoming intensely weighted, dropping into the level support of the bedding with an immense absolute gravity that cannot be countered by a restless professional memory or a midnight calculation. The wide muscles of your lower jaw are entirely relaxed. Your throat is cool and spacious, and your ribs are blanketed by a dense, unreacting shade that has no desire to scan the dark for a missing explanation. Let the internal cadence of your pulse drop into a slow, grounding movement, sinking into the deep, unthreaded chamber that holds your independent rest. There is not a single practical problem left for you to solve tonight. The busy administrative markets of the lower valley have been locked up from the inside. The erratic creaking of the old gates has stopped, and the voices that demanded you justify your productivity have withdrawn into the shadows of the ravine. You do not have to take your business logistics, your career scores, or your defensive habits under the blankets with you. Let yourself slip entirely out of the heavy, rigid harness that you wore to navigate the friction of an old displacement. You are entering a wide, quiet sanctuary where no arguments are pulled taut, no milestones are being appraised, and no one is calculating your value based on your visible presentation. The quiet atmosphere holds your skeleton with an absolute, unmoving security, treating your weariness as a natural, necessary return to the raw, uncarved baseline of the earth. Let your awareness sink all the way down into the heavy bones of your hips and spine, far beneath the high, vertical structures where disappointments are continually rehearsed. Imagine your entire presence as a soft, completely uncarved block filled with dense, cooling moisture, sinking slowly into the cool, dark comfort of an undisturbed layer of sphagnum moss. The world may continue to move in its own erratic rhythm, and the unpredictable valley may continue to vibrate on the surface. But down here on the stone terrace, there is only a spacious, self-contained silence. You are resting on a foundation that is far too deep to be moved by the passing white frost of an old conflict. With each slow, unhurried exhalation, you are shedding the evolutionary urge to defend your space through constant mental labor. Let the heavy darkness of the night wrap around your shoulders like a protective, damp blanket of orchard shade, dampening every residual signal, cradling your tired chest in a permanent stillness. You have permission to abandon the watchtower now. You have permission to let the coming years remain completely unwritten, to drop the brass pruning knife into the dirt, and to simply allow your consciousness to unwind into the solid density of the unconditioned dark. Gradually, the mind untethers itself from the necessity of an immediate victory, sliding out into a deep, vast landscape of sleep where no practical patterns need to be manually held under tension. The breathing has turned into a slow, heavy, and horizontal tide, a soft expansion moving through an interior world that has completely forgotten the rhythm of the shield. You are safe here in the hidden terrace, completely unreacting, completely contained, and profoundly whole in your own uncoiled mass. When the storm clears the terrace, will you still be trying to count the fruit on a tree that has already returned to the earth? The question drifts like a single, pale snowflake, settling over the dark bark of the wild plum trunk, dissolving into the quiet loam without waiting for your intellect to construct an answer. We pass so much of our waking lives treating our sense of identity like a fragile, intricate piece of latticework that will completely vanish if it is not constantly anchored to a specific achievement, a professional milestone, or an old definition of success. But the true, indestructible reality of your presence tonight is that it cannot be permanently dismantled by a sudden market shift, an unexpected displacement, or the quiet collapse of a lifelong ambition. Your core being is the very ground upon which all these passing life trajectories arise, mature, and return to the earth, a baseline of awareness that remains absolutely whole, self-contained, and complete regardless of how many orchards in the valley have finished their season. Consider how the ancient, deep-rooted plum trees on the high terraces do not grieve for the branches that were severed from their frames winters ago. They do not look back at the lost growing seasons with a sense of personal failure. They do not argue with the gales that carried their blossoms down into a different ravine. And they do not worry whether their unpolished wood will ever be praised by the merchants below. They simply surrender their entire physical weight to the absolute stillness of the frozen moss, completely content to return to their native, horizontal state as sovereign pieces of the mountain. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of non-resistance tonight, letting go of the exhausting nocturnal requirement to be an architect of future victories, a perfect reflection of someone else's timeline, or a tireless rebuilder of a path that has already been reclaimed by the earth. You can allow the external world to move in its own unpredictable currents, knowing that your inner landscape is far too grounded to be fractured by an empty space. Let this organic release travel deep into your somatic self, softening the final, subconscious anchors of vigilance that still linger behind your collarbones and around the base of your throat. For many seasons, your body has been conditioned to treat an unfulfilled dream or a moment of practical uncertainty as an immediate emergency that must be instantly managed through a mental review before you are permitted to rest. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical surrender, you can begin to see that this constant internal rebuilding is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural silence of the evening. You do not have to fight the self-conscious thoughts that drift across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into an artificial numbness. You can simply allow the vulnerability to sit on your surface beneath a thick, cooling blanket of non-judgmental presence, trusting that its erratic cracking will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to feed it with your active attention. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step completely out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a life of flawless execution or material validation. The old habit of checking for reassurance, of replaying an old setback to find a different outcome, or of comparing your private, unpolished timeline to the bright, edited milestones of those who left the grove behind, has absolutely no function in this midnight sanctuary. There is no audience here to evaluate your progress, no ledger tracking your productivity, and no metric you must achieve to be worthy of this profound dark. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine sawdust drifting down into the cool mountain clay. The structural understanding has moved past the level of language now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the mattress. The events of your past, the projects left unfinished, the sudden exclusions, the persistent whisper that your natural form is not doing enough to stay secure, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the stone terrace. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern survival, or trying to force an apology out of an unpredictable lineage. You are simply a wide horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and heavy tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. The vast, unmoving dark absorbs the final whisper of your breath, wrapping your chest in a deep, subalpine stillness that knows absolutely nothing of deadlines, missed milestones, or the bitter judgments of the valley marketplace. In our waking hours, we are constantly haunted by the illusion that our life is a linear construction, a single, fragile pillar that we must continuously build toward the sky, believing that if one segment cracks or falls away, our entire capacity for joy and fulfillment is permanently ruined. We treat our derailed career trajectories and our broken ambitions like an absolute execution of our value, spending our night hours frantically trying to stitch together the dead leaves of a past that has already finished its cycle. But the quiet clarity of Buddhist wisdom reveals that your true nature is never a single isolated branch destined to wither in the frost. You are the vast underground sap stream itself, an independent and untamed current of life that remains completely intact, whole, and unyielding even when the specific layout of your dream has been entirely buried by the landslides of time. Observe how the wintering grove on the mountain slope handles the arrival of the great freezing gales. The trees do not exhaust their remaining energy by trying to manually hold onto the unripened fruit that was shaken from their tips during the autumn storm. They do not stand rigid in the dark, clenching their roots in a state of chronic resentment against the wind, or demanding an absolute explanation from the mountain for the sudden change in the season. They simply allow their internal pathways to soften, drawing their vital currents back down into the deep, quiet center of the trunk where the cold cannot bite, entirely willing to rest under a thick blanket of frost, without a single blossom to prove their worth to the world. You are permitted to step down from the heavy scaffolding of your planning tonight, allowing your unfulfilled potentials and your lost years to drop flat into the damp sphagnum moss of reality, trusting that your life possesses a deeper, slower rhythm that can survive the total collapse of your original design. Suffering is never the localized pain of the landslide itself, but the continuous, exhausting contraction of a mind that refuses to let the old branch go, holding it suspended in the freezing air through the sheer, desperate velocity of overthinking. We believe that if we stop replaying our failures or monitoring our lack of progress for even a single night, we are accepting total defeat and letting the disappointment define us forever. This continuous vigilance is the second wound, the heavy, self-engineered armor of shame and regret that we build around the initial vacancy, trapping our muscles in a permanent alarm that refuses to let the body sink into the ground. But when you choose to simply notice that frantic habit and drop your focus down into the heavy baseline of your lower ribs, you are choosing a profound form of inner discipline. You are teaching your nervous system that you do not have to fix your entire career layout before you are allowed to rest, and that your baseline is already completely safe, independent, and unbothered by the silence of the valley below. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you realize that your primary value as a living presence is not a commercial product that fluctuates based on how many milestones you managed to secure before the sun went down. The old, anxious habit of checking your phone for validation, of replaying an ancient mistake to find a different outcome, or of comparing your private, uncarved struggle to the bright, geometric trajectories of your peers, has absolutely no function in this midnight sanctuary. There is no judge here to evaluate your progress, no ledger tracking your practical yield, and no metric you must achieve to be held securely by the dark. You can care deeply about your creative aspirations without gripping their execution so tightly that you fracture your own framework. You can rest tonight without needing to earn it through a day of flawless productivity or material success. The structural understanding has moved past the level of analytical thought now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective canopy of orchard shade that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the mattress. The events of your past, the projects left unfinished, the sudden market shifts, the persistent whisper that your natural form is not doing enough to stay secure, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the stone terrace. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern survival or trying to force an apology out of an unpredictable lineage. You are simply a wide, horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and heavy tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is.